Welcome to Risk Hedge Video. My name is Jonathan Roth. I'm coming to you from Vancouver. I'm joined by Dr. Theodore Karasik. He's a senior advisor to Gulf State Analytics. He's joining me from Washington, D.C. Dr. Karasik, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you about something that's developing here fairly quickly, and that's maybe an alternative viewpoint on what actually happened in Syria here about a week and a half ago when the United States launched a missile attack on a Syrian airfield as a response to an alleged chemical attack. What are you hearing right now about what may have happened as opposed to what we've been told happened?
Yeah, there's some alternative theories that have been going around about what happened with the airstrikes against this target in Syria. I think it's interesting to explore because it brings up some alternative ideas about what is ongoing in Syria and the trajectory of the civil war in Syria itself. The story is that not all missiles made their target. There were supposed to be 60. One malfunctioned on one of the ships. 36 made target. The remainder did not. And there's a question of where did they go? So this alternative story is that 36 made to target. The missing ones were either brought down by S-300 battery or were taken over by Russian electronic jamming and were plunged into the sea. Now, this alternative theory means that the US and Russia have already clashed, if you will, technically, with the use of the TLAMs and them being intercepted or taken over by Russian control. This is very important because it illustrates that we've had our first encounter with the Russians. And that sets the stage for potentially future encounters between Washington and Russia on the Syrian battlefield, and whether they want to cross that line or not. It's clear that if you believe this theory, that the Russians are supplying more S-300 systems to the Syrians in order for them to protect their infrastructure. It also means that the S-300, if you believe the story, is a viable system that can bring down American technology when it is launched. So what we're seeing now in terms of the wanting to get to the bottom of the actual chemical attack itself and what really happened on that story is important, because this also goes to the heart of why the TLAMs were used in the first place, was to send a message to Assad about the use of chemical weapons. But there are alternative theories coming out regarding whether or not this was Sarin gas or not. There's still some skeptics out there who argue that this is instead not sarin, but a mix of toxic industrial chemicals from the site that was attacked, and that the gas itself was toxic, that brought on symptoms similar to a chemical attack. But the problem here is that sarin is odorless, and the victims were all complaining of an odor. So we're not clear yet on exactly what was used in this attack, nor are we clear on the alternative theories regarding how many TLAMs actually connected to their target, because the target, the airbase, was emptied out because we warned the Russians, we the Americans, warned the Russians that this attack was coming. So the Russians and the Syrians who were there were able to clear out from this base, so it became a symbolic target.
Okay, Dr. Karasik, you just talked about two extremely big, separate but obviously intertwined issues. So
Absolutely.
Let's go back to the essentially the story that the United States and Russia tangoed over Syrian airspace with their Tomahawk, American Tomahawk missiles, and Russian. I guess it's S-300 or S-400s. I've read in various places that they have both systems in Syria. Do we know what system was actually guarding this particular airbase?
According to this story, there are S-300s and S-400s systems in Syria protecting particular assets, whether they're Syrian or Russian assets. In Latakia, particularly, you may find the S-400, but the S-300. What's so important about this story is that it illustrates that the S-300 actually works. There was a lot of debate within defense industrial circles about how well the S-300 would perform against Western technology. Now we seem to have an example with a TLAM up against an S-300 system. Now the next question is if there is other ordnance that is used, let's say from an F-15 fighter, how will that go up against an S-300 system? That's the question that everybody seems to be asking.
Okay, and just quickly to clarify, a TLAM, that's a Tomahawk or a variant?
It is a Tomahawk. It is a Tomahawk missile. It's the acronym for the Tomahawk.
Okay, so going back to this story, why don't you give me some background or maybe context in terms of how you've heard the story, or this is a story floating around Washington. Where's the genesis of this story coming from?
Yeah, the genesis is really coming from a number of different sources, not only in Washington itself, but also in the Gulf, as well as from other sources from Russia. There are observers who are noting that there was an agreement between Washington and Moscow to send a message to Assad that there is not to be any more chemical weapons use, even barrel bombs, against the Syrian populace. This agreement between Washington and Moscow was meant to send a message directly to Assad and his military not to be participating in these kinds of operations anymore. The agreement to empty out the base was to give a message, was to give time to the Russians to fulfill their, to get out of the way. But on the other hand, this agreement also gave the Russians an opportunity to test their S-300 system in live fire action. This in itself, as part of the story, means that the Russians wanted to also test their systems against the Americans. This rather complicated story is important because it shows that the US and Russia wanted to not only send a message to Assad, but also to show that really, does this equipment really work that has been touted for so many years to protect particular types of infrastructure? The Russian systems, particularly with the S-300 or the S-400 or another system called the Tor, which is being used in several countries around the world for air defense. It's important to see whether or not these systems work in live fire or not. That might have been part of the story here.
So I just want to clarify this point then. It seems to me like there might have been various levels of the Russian government, whether that be the military or political, that were looking at this scenario emerging in Syria. And at some level, the political side said we need an agreement with the Americans to force Assad so he never uses chemical weapons again. And then there was obviously further down the chain, maybe in the military might have said, look, we want to test out these S-300, S-400 missiles and see what they'll do. So where was the interaction between those various levels of the Russian government vis-a-vis this attack?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not very clear yet on the division of labor, if you will, on this episode. There is some indications to say that the Russians publicly wanted to make clear that they had nothing to do with chemical weapons in Syria. Yet within the Russian armed forces, and particularly within the general staff and on the command chain down, they wanted to see and send a message to the Americans that we can't shoot down your missiles. And that's what happened, according to this theory.
Okay, so there's part one of the story. Now the second part of the story is whether or not sarin gas was actually used, that you already talked about. And I have in front of me the report that I know the White House issued, that my understanding was that typically a report like this would be issued by the CIA or the Defense Intelligence Agency or something along those lines. But this was actually released by the White House and by General McMaster, the National Security Advisor. And the first paragraph says, quote, "The United States is confident that the Syrian regime conducted a chemical weapons attack using the nerve agent sarin against its own people," and then it goes on from there. So you're saying that there are legitimate questions as to whether or not sarin was actually used.
Apparently, the location of the attack itself is in an industrial area where there are a lot of toxic industrial chemicals located. The attack on this location produced a toxic cloud that was deadly enough, obviously, to kill and maim hundreds. The toxic industrial gas here it's very similar to some other instances where industrial plants have been attacked and clouds of toxic gas has killed or maimed hundreds. The issue here is that in this particular attack, that where this industrial gas was released, this is not in any way related to a sarin type attack. Sarin is an odorless agent. Here in this attack, the victims complained that they smelled an odor. The other part of it too is that this attack that released this industrial gas, the medics who were treating the victims were not appropriately dressed for a sarin attack, and thus they too would have been contaminated in some type of way. Hence, the idea that sarin was behind this attack is questionable. Yes, there was an industrial toxic agent that killed and maimed people, but whether or not it was sarin or not still has not been proven.
Okay. I mean, I've heard all kinds of analysis by various figures. There's Britain's former ambassador to Syria has been downplaying the fact that Assad would have used sarin. Obviously, the Russians, it's in their interest to say it wasn't sarin. And then on the Western side, we're hearing everyone saying it was sarin. How quickly, if it was indeed sarin gas, and this is this document that the White House released, essentially said that it was for 100% sure, and they said that they got that information from both assets on the ground and also signals intelligence. What do you think's really going on here? Because there seems to be a lot of smoke and nobody quite knows what the fire really is.
I think that there are multiple stories ongoing here that we're not really clear of the correct narrative. I think that's important to understand that we still don't have all the answers. I think there was a rush to judgment on saying that this was sarin gas. And I think that there needs to be a lot more investigation into exactly the agent that was being used here. Nevertheless, there has been a tremendous crime committed regardless. And the point is that there has to be an accountability for the deaths of these innocent victims. So an airstrike as a response was an appropriate message. but there's still so much more here that we do not have the complete story on, that there needs to be a better understanding of it and how that is going to affect the settlement, if you will, of the Syrian situation vis-a-vis the fight against Daesh, because that's really what this is all about.
Become a Risk Hedge Insider for free by visiting riskhedge.com. Each week you'll receive vital analysis on today's geopolitical, financial, and social risks. Just visit riskhedge.com today to become a Risk Hedge Insider.